Look, there's tons going on Monday. When I come back, there always is. We have a very important guest who is running for office that I want to talk to as well. Very important. And yet, the history bug kicks into me all the time here. So I want to do a little of that. Then there's a lot I want to cover tonight. I'm glad you're here. I think it's going to be a fantastic program. All 3 hours. President of the United States, in a very important statement about Tim Kaine, as he was speaking to a group of the faithful at the Museum of the Bible. I've been there. That's a fantastic place. If you ever come to Washington, D.C., my family and I have been there. I encourage you to check it out. It's focused primarily on the Christian faith, but also the Jewish faith as a lead-up to the Christian faith. But I think you're going to love it. I really do. And it's a straight-up, course on the Bible, the history of the Bible, the history of the various individuals in the Bible and the events and so forth. It's just killer. But here's the president at the museum today, and I want to build on this after you listen to this. Cut one, go.
Last week when the ineffectual senator from Virginia, a man named Tim Kaine, stated that the notion our rights come from our Creator is, quote, extremely troubling to him. Very troubling, isn't it troubling? Isn't it terrible, though? How he would say something like that, and advocated really by a totalitarian regime. This is what they say. But as everyone in this room understands, it is tyrants who are denying our rights and the rights that come from God. And it's this Declaration of Independence that proclaims we're endowed by our Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The senator from Virginia should be ashamed of himself for many things. For many things. For things even beyond that. But in its own way, nothing's more important than those words. They were terrible words.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to dig into this further, because nobody's doing a better job of leading this fight than the president and Ted Cruz, and we here. This has been something we've been teaching here and talking about here for nearly a quarter of a century. And it matters. That's why I do it. Perhaps the most difficult book in terms of reading, in terms of scholarship for many people, was my book Ameritopia, which followed Liberty and Tyranny. And yet it's one of my favorite. And after I wrote this book, I decided I can't write books like this now. We're not all trying to get PhDs and everything else. We're trying to comprehend and understand and advance the cause. And it was written in 2012. It was written 13 years ago. And I point out the importance, crucial importance, of John Locke. The influence of Locke. And on chapter 6, I have John Locke and the nature of man. On chapter 7, the influence of Locke on the founders. I just want to touch on this a little bit so you have a tremendous background on this. John Locke was the most important philosopher to the founders of this country during the Revolutionary period. There's no question about it. And there was once a great professor from Yale who actually looked at every piece of public writings at the time that he possibly could, including pamphlets and newspapers and so forth, speeches, and it was Locke. And during the constitutional period, it was Montesquieu. These are great thinkers from the 1500s, from what we call the Enlightenment period. Now, what Locke said in part, he not only underscored the importance of things like property rights and so forth and so on, But no government, including one established by the consent of the governed, has authority to violate man's inalienable rights. And Locke explains that the law of nature exists above all else, and all men are required to obey it, including those who hold public office. And he wrote in part, thus the law of nature stands as an eternal rule to all men, legislators as well as others. Legislators as well as others. The rules that they make for other men's actions must, as well as their own and other men's actions, be conformable to the law of nature, that is, to the will of God, of which that is a declaration, and the fundamental law of nature being the preservation of mankind. No human sanction can be good or valid against it. So the first sentence of the Declaration encapsulates Locke's view of the preeminence of natural law and the right to disobey and indeed throw off a government that abuses it. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them for the separation. The entire purpose of the American Revolution was to throw off a government. And the entire argument was built upon God conveying rights to his children, you. Folks, I have a question for you. Do you believe America's best days are still ahead? With the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence coming up in less than a year, my friends at the Heritage Foundation are taking stock of the current situation, and they need your input. They've launched a survey on America's future to gauge how Americans feel right now about where we are as a nation and where we're headed in the next 250 years. You know, for decades, your American values have been under attack, but now, with President Trump's administration in office, we have an opportunity to turn the tide and usher in a new golden age for America. But the Heritage Foundation needs to hear from you. What policies do patriots like you most care about? What do you believe are the defining principles of America? What legacy do you believe we should pass on to the next generation? Please visit heritage.org/Levin today and share your feedback and help shape the future of America. That's heritage.org/LEVIN. Paid for by the Heritage Foundation. Now, I break this down in this book, example after example. I say, Locke writes, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, this is Locke, which is the law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, all the servants of one sovereign master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, and being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another. Or if we were made for one another's uses, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours. Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, and not to quit his station willfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, and he goes on. So the founders embraced Locke's vision that all men are blessed by God with inalienable rights. The life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another, quote unquote, which they describe this way. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and Levin, in the pursuit of happiness. It is the job of government to preserve those rights. Government doesn't give you those rights. It doesn't create those rights. It's its job to preserve those rights. Want another example? In this book, I give example after example. Again, Locke explains that any government not established by the consent of the governed is illegitimate, and therefore its laws are illegitimate. Nor can a government established by the consent of the people exercise absolute power or surrender its legitimate power to another. Why? For the very reasons we just stated. The laws of nature, and you have your own rights, independent of government. Independent of government. That to secure these rights, says your declaration, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. To do what? To secure these rights. What rights? Natural rights. Unalienable rights. That's what your declaration is talking about. It's really quite stunning, isn't it? It's quite stunning that a United States Senator talks as Tim Kaine did. But here's the problem. This is the real unstated yet real position of the Democrat Party. Now, who's John Locke? He lived from 1632. The Enlightenment, I would guess, is from like the 1500s into the 1600s. Had an enormous influence on the American founding and consequently American society. He did not seek ways to destroy the sovereignty of the individual. He sought to understand and cultivate it. Locke explained the true nature of man, including his acquisition of knowledge and use of intuition, reason, and sensation. It's not necessary to agree with all of Locke's conclusions to celebrate his extraordinary insight. In an essay concerning human understanding published in 1690, which really is a book of sorts, it's an extensive examination of the capacity of the human mind, including its limits. Locke dramatically distinguished his philosophical approach from what I call utopians. For Locke, the individual has value, dignity, and significance. Rather than advance a dogma in search of a fantasy, Locke believed that the individual's mind was worth exploring, as if lecturing modern-day liberals. That's right. He's a brilliant man. Locke carried forward his scrutiny of man's understanding, I'm bouncing around in the book, with an anti-authoritarian approach to civil society and governance. Now keep in mind, he was explicitly rejecting Thomas Hobbes. In other words, there were other philosophers, contemporary and earlier, that he was taking on with his viewpoints, that Montesquieu was taking on with his viewpoints. And no philosopher, quite frankly, has a philosophy that is without some influence by others, either pro or con. By equality, as an example, Locke does not mean equality of outcomes or result. He does not mean conformity. Early in his great book, The Second Treatise of Government, Locke introduces the notion of the individual's God-given inalienable rights, of which all individuals are entitled, and which provide the moral condition for a civil society. Here's what he says. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone in reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, which I mentioned earlier. Locke observed that men generally get along with each other in the state of nature for their own sake and the sake of the community, although it certainly is not perfect. State of war exists in the state of nature only when one individual violates the laws of nature, that is, the inalienable rights of others. Therefore, although the state of nature is not the violent, fearful condition that people like Hobbes describe, the laws of nature are and can be violated. And so he goes on and on about the laws of nature and nature's God. He goes on about God himself. And of all the philosophers who came before your founders, when they turned to the Declaration of Independence, there were others too, but they mainly turned to him. And Tim Kaine rejects him 100%. Tim Kaine embraces what is a fascistic, Marxist, Islamist, overlaying philosophy, and then condemns what Locke wrote, what others wrote, what your founders believed in, as like Iran. That is sick.